I've been putting this one off for a bit, not intentionally, but anyway, I'm getting to it now. So this is from Lori Magdalene. She's also here in San Francisco. I met with her once, and she sent me this piece of writing to read. So I'm gonna read it for everybody here. It's called "Hooker with a Heart of Mud," and I have not read it yet. So hopefully it's doesn't have too many surprises, or maybe hopefully it does have surprises. I sit every day and spy on all the broken people. Their fractured lives and problems scream to me from the reflection in the mirror, hanging above the doorway of the little dollar store that is my neighbor. The mirror is dirty and scratched, like many of the patrons who walk through its door, and it is a replacement for the glass of the transom that long ago shattered into a million pieces, due to some prepubescent delinquent's idea of a prank. No longer a participant in life, I am now merely an observer. I examine the eccentricities and banalities of each passerby, grabbing a hold of a little piece of their essence like a little kid stealing a piece of gum from the five and dime. No real harm done to the proprietor, who will likely never even notice. Like most who are drawn to the act of thieving, rituals play a huge component in my daily routine. Today was gearing up to be a muggy summer day, lingering on the verge of rain, which meant Turkish coffee and a sticky sweet roll for breakfast. The heavy feeling in my belly combined with the sludge at the bottom of my cup, reflecting the dank and oppressive atmosphere outside my window. It was years ago, on a day very similar to today, that I first encountered her. The infamous whore with the heart of mud. See, most living creatures carry with them a fertile, healthy place within their hearts. Let us liken it to an earthy soil, where special interactions are stored, many of which end up creating seed pods that eventually germinate, sprout, and grow. As we continue to engage with others, we fertilize and/or exchange our bits of life force and ideologies, our souls growing and evolving along the way. Mildred, however, lacked something vital. It was apparent the moment I laid eyes upon her. She was dressed in drab colors that have matched her interior, but definitely did not match her profession. In fact, I would be surprised if she owned any of the screaming neons or slinky, glittery numbers that were the staple of her peers. Her makeup looked as though it had been smeared with Vaseline, yet underneath, one could imagine a face that might have at one time been, if not pretty, then at least relatively attractive. These days, however, she was clearly not of the high-class escort caliber, but instead walked the streets alongside the sniveling junkies and the screaming psychos. In all of my years of amassing pieces of souls, I have accumulated all different types and manners of personalities, but not once had I stumbled across a heart so devoid of life as with Mildred. Even her name evoked a lament for the lost, and in her I sensed a drudgery for life. However, I did not expect to find such a morose landscape within. It was as if there had never been life inside this woman's heart. Instead, just a washed-up mess of sludge resided there, unable to produce even the tiniest seedling, no matter the intensity of interaction. I found that even the deadest souls have remnants of life left in their hearts. That was until I had come across Mildred. The soil of these lost souls may be dried up, and the plant life withered and worn, but one can still glimpse what once was, like a Kirlian photograph. The aura may be faint and lack vitality, but there remains enough animus for the smallest contribution in their day-to-day confrontations with others in the world. For some, it may merely be fragments of decay worming their way into another's sacred space, and this is okay too, as the bacterium and such making up the putrescence keeps in keeping the heart's soil nourished. I had been collecting what little snippets of life I could ensnare by claiming a teeny bit more than I would normally receive with each interaction. Over the years, I discovered that it was possible to snag what I craved by way of observation instead, so these days I cautiously snip off a piece of those I am interested in. Once I have my prize, I spirit it away to my secret place, where I carefully place it inside a jar and let the magic of another bit of human vitality captured find its bearings, eventually making the glass confines a cozy new home, ready to thrive, stagnate, or decay, depending on the soul from which it was taken. Mildred had nothing to capture. I had been watching her now for a very long time, always expecting that one day I would witness something inside of her. This had not been the case. She was dead inside in the truest fashion, and this fascinated me. Since long ago, I had lost the ability to truly engage and communicate with the world. I had to develop a plan that would allow me to explore the mystery behind the woman so devoid of life, the woman I had been scrutinizing for ages. Like me, she also had her own set of rituals, one of which was to frequent the dollar store every Sunday afternoon. She would walk the aisles, one after the other, stooping to inspect a candle or tube of lipstick, but ultimately it was in the children's section where she reveled with delight, and interestingly enough, she managed to come to a decision on her purchase for the day. A ragged baby doll, a mouse figurine with a jagged, broken ear, even a legless action figure was among the souvenirs I had already witnessed her acquire. These trinkets must hold a significant eventuality for her despite their junky appearance, since each discovery was always an act that took extreme concentration until the choice for that day had been made. As I prepared another cup of Turkish coffee, I decided that on this Sunday I would put my plan into action. After Mildred made her toy selection and settled outside the door for her usual cigarette, I would be standing by, awaiting her next move, so I could then follow her and discover more about this seemingly lifeless being. I knew that I would have to be hyper-vigilant if I were to be successful, since Mildred did not carry that spark of life, which meant it would be easier for me to lose sight of her. The idea was for me to stay as close to her as possible without her knowledge. I would continue to spy on her until I finally made sense of how someone so dead could walk amongst the living with no one the wiser. As Sunday approached, I began to envision what my day might be like. After all, this was an odd enterprise to undertake, and it was difficult to imagine the world of a woman who held no spark of life within her, one who seemingly never did. Even the hookers I knew, that had long ago lost their ferocity, still held within them a minute link to the core of who they were, and an essence of life inside their souls. What must the exchange with one of her tricks be like? Would he notice the utter lack of life inside this woman? Would he even care? Would any of them? Finally, my day of adventure arrived. While waiting for her to emerge, I snuck away to check on my secret little jars, hidden away in my secret little place. I shut my blinds on the off chance that someone might be spying in on me and discover my confidential retreat. Years ago, I was lucky enough to have procured a position as a building supervisor. I felt extremely lucky to have secured such an arrangement, since in those days, women were not usually trusted in what was considered a man's job. One day, while I attended to a problem with the furnace, a teensy mouse ran over my foot before coming to a halt outside a door that was once used as the janitor's closet prior to renovations that had been made on the building. The creature looked up at me, eyes sentient and begging to be heard. I dug into one of my many pockets and pulled out a peanut butter cracker left over from my lunch. I bent down to my tiny new friend and offered him a bite. He took a nibble, and I started to go back about my business. On my hands and knees, I continued to tinker with the furnace, but was interrupted by my mouse friend, who began squeaking with the urgency of a fire engine. I sprung to my feet to find my diminutive companion scurry to my side, then proceed to circle around my feet in a series of figure eights before darting back to the door. I figured he wanted another nibble and was happy to oblige. This time, however, when I presented the cracker to him, he refused it, then zipped around my feet once more before rushing back to the door, where he began screeching like mad. He started to slam his body against the door, a battering ram brought to life. When he finally stopped, he hopped onto his back legs, that much too conscious look crossing his face. That is the moment I noticed a peculiarity about his appearance. His ear looked as though it had been ripped off, then sewn back together. It made very little sense that a creature such as this would have someone fix his broken ear, yet apparently that was the case. A human hand using glue or a needle and thread was the only way the perfectly zigzagging scar could have been made. I was beyond intrigued and rushed to find the key that fit the lock. With some fumbling, I was able to disengage the rusty fitting, and to my disappointment, found nothing more than an empty room. Apparently I was missing something, because my buddy raced inside, making quite a racket as he did so, and wouldn't let up until I followed. He was definitely on a mission, and expected me to tag along. I couldn't find a light switch, so I pulled out my flashlight in order to capture a better view. Its beam danced around the space, expecting to find perhaps a discarded piece of gourmet cheese, a mummified cat, or some such element that might excite a mouse to this degree. Instead, the creature was sitting at the far end of the room, acting more like a normal little mouse, rather than the cognizant being that I had been dealing with only moments ago. Disheartened, I turned to leave to get back to the job at hand, but was stopped in my tracks by what sounded like a shrill yelping of a word. Secret. I focused the beam of light onto him, only to find the mundane action of his paws washing his face, refusing to give me even an inkling of recognition of the magic that had just transpired. This was getting to be too much to ignore, so I marched over to him, bent to his level, and asked him what it was that he wanted from me. Nothing. Okay, this was enough silliness, I decided, and did an about face so I could once again get back to my work. As soon as my back was turned, I very distinctly heard it again, the word secret, spoken in a mousy voice, if a mouse could in fact speak, that is. I was becoming agitated. Had my self-imposed exile from actual human beings caused me to lose my mind? I had already had a frustrating morning since I had utilized the very last space for my magical jars, and had no idea what I was going to do. I mean, I couldn't stop collecting. It was the only company I had in my life. Not to mention that over time, I had begun to form relationships with the enchantments inside, who were each displaying their own unique characteristics. And now, I was either crazy as a loon or was too dense to realize exactly what this animal was trying to convey to me. Hell-bent on getting to the bottom of this new mystery, I marched back into the room, Only this time I immediately spotted what it was Mr. Mouse had been trying so desperately to get me to see. He reacted to my realization, an acrobat, leaping into the air. Before my previously veiled eyes, hidden in the grain of the paneling, was a false wall. With some tenacity, I was able to knock it aside, and this is where I found my new space for my precious little friends. The real kicker was that it harbored a dilapidated passageway that led straight to the apartment in which I now resided. How amazing was that? With a little work and some shelving, this would be the perfect location for my mystical world to inhabit. This wondrous area allowed me to add to my collection, and I found that the more jars I obtained, the more they began to affect one another, and the further they appeared to be evolving. Although my visit today would be brief, I still felt the same elation as always as I shimmied my body through the spiraling passageway. As I unlocked the homemade door and stepped inside my special room, I was struck by the luminescence, manifesting from several more of the jars, miniature twinkles of light emanating from the liveliest souls, and all of them dancing with their own life inside, be it growth or decay. They were all alive and in their own unique state of development. I was struck by just how different Mildred was from the rest of humanity. A soul labeled Julie was especially animated today. Her sparkles flitting this way and that, seemingly almost aware of my presence, like the fish I once had as a child, that would move about the aquarium, swimming in time to my fluttering fingertips. Unfortunately, I did not have the time today to ponder their consciousness, as Mildred would soon be making her Sunday trip to the dollar store, and I didn't want to miss her. Mr. Mouse scurried my way to let me know he was still playing sentinel to our extraordinary menagerie, so I gave him his usual treat. I then blew them all a kiss to let them know my appreciation for them, and wormed my way back through the corridor and up into the closet of my own apartment. By the time I threw on my hat, grabbed a pair of binoculars, and rushed outside and into the dollar store, Mildred was already exploring the items in the children's aisle, handling each novelty as if each one held a treasure inside its plastic encasement. She was dressed in her usual ensemble, ill-fitting shorts, army drab in color with a tight knit top of a lesser hue. She continued to rifle through the various baubles, trinkets, and figurines, eventually seizing a minuscule stuffed rabbit whose face was soiled in a number of places with an oily black substance, and whose left eyelid had been ripped off, the fraying stitching still visible. Between the smudges and the tattered eye, the bunny looked more like a floppy-eared boxer than the childhood toy it was meant to be. She immediately rushed to the checkout line, gripping her odd discovery as if she was holding a priceless artifact. I held back a bit since I knew she would take a moment to smoke a cigarette, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't blow my cover this soon into the game. I perused the items near the front of the store so I could keep my eye on Mildred, and once her cigarette had burned down to the filter, I grabbed an innocuous pair of sunglasses, paid the cashier, and bolted out the door, just in time to catch a glimpse of her snaking her way around the corner of the building. I crept along, keeping a moderate distance between us, in case she had noticed me inside the store. What I witnessed next, although subtle in nature, left me with a haunting feeling that I couldn't quite shake, and I kept questioning myself as to whether I had actually seen what I knew in my head I had so clearly spotted. For a moment, the clouds moved across the sky, and the sun briefly shone down, its rays painting the alleyway with splashes of daylight. Mildred kept her pace, but as I watched her, I noticed there was something lacking in this atmosphere. newly awash with glimmering golden beams. And then it dawned on me. Mildred was not casting a shadow. It was as if her body was immune to the effects of sunlight shining down upon her. To behold such a sight brought about a mixture of emotions ranging from wonderment to revulsion, and with that a self-consciousness in what I was doing, as well as my reasons for doing it. I suddenly felt more like an intruder and less like an adventurer. I hung back a little further, picturing myself now as a spider scuttling quietly along my web of curiosities, waiting for the opportunity to plunge my fangs into the emptiness and drink in the answers I so desired. Mildred continued on, weaving in and out of the alley's refuse. Before hitting the main street, she stopped to apply more lipstick, then turned the corner just as the sun once again hid behind the clouds. Her pace quickened and she began to wave to a man wearing an expensive suit, the color of shadows. He nodded back and she motioned for him to meet her in the next alley. By his impeccable appearance, I was a little surprised that he would be seeing someone like Mildred. Maybe he was one of those men that enjoyed the adventure of slumming it. I had the feeling that this was my big chance to discover some of the secrets buried inside Mildred's heart, so I carefully made my way to the alley. Luckily, there was a host of dumpsters to provide me the opportunity to eye the pair without being noticed. Mildred and her companion had already found their spot, which fortunately for me, allowed the perfect vantage point in which to observe this interaction. The two seemed particularly intimate, considering their relationship. He caressed her hair, and she playfully walked her fingers down his chest, popping open buttons along the way. Although the picture of the two was bizarre, the way they were coming together started to take on an ethereal quality that actually seemed to be impacting Mildred's features, softening them along with her touch, which held more grace with each stroke to her client's body. The sun momentarily peeked through the clouds, and Mildred pulled her trick into the shade. Pretty soon she was on her knees. She began to unzip his pants, gently maneuvering her way past the opening in his boxer shorts to expose his rock-hard erection, her every caress taking another year off of her appearance. The transformation was so profound that I began to question my own sanity. Was I really seeing this? I tried to blink away my crazy, but to no effect. In fact, Mildred was not only looking younger now, she also possessed striking magnetism that was intensified by an inner glow that was coming off of her in vibratory waves. Only moments ago, this prostitute was as dowdy as my own grandmother, but now she had blossomed into a full-fledged sexual goddess, a revelation that her client clearly had already discovered. As she came closer to making him come, the most remarkable thing happened. A succulent, deep green stem began to grow out of her heart's muck. Due to the rate of growth, I was reminded of the time-lapse imagery often used in nature documentaries, while I watched as tender leaves shot out, unfurling themselves up and down the length of the stalk, as her hand moved up and down the length of his shaft. The couple's movement took on a rhythm so strong I could almost hear it tugging at my own heart's song. A gentle pounding at first that teased at my soul, coaxing me to lose myself in this feral energy that continued to heighten. Her lover was holding on to this experience, trying to make it last as his own heart pulsated in time with hers, its internal life brimming with new possibilities. I suddenly realized that the passion of this exchange between the now beautiful Mildred and her invigorated lover was impacting me in a sexual way as well. My panties were quickly being soaked with my own pussy juices, and I was aching for release as well. I couldn't resist letting my fingers find their way to my own genitals as the man came closer and closer to his own release. I was tingly all over, and the warmth emanating from my pussy only served to turn me on to an even greater degree. I began to work my fingers over the cloth of my panties, only allowing myself a teasing caress, which immediately made my body ache for more. Feeling as though I was now part of this interaction, I began to gush again, my entire body alive with a vibratory energy that started in my cunt and reverberated outward. I hadn't felt this alive or this in touch with humanity in ages. I could see that his orgasm was close at hand, so I resisted the temptation of ripping off my panties. And well, I'm not really sure what. Perhaps trying to join them, or just try to beat off furiously, finding my way from voyeur to participant. I was too scared that I would miss something if I let myself come, so I sat back and watched as Mildred's fingers continued to pinch at his nipples, her now delicate fingertips alternately pulling and tugging on the tender flesh, causing his back to arch as he surrendered to his goddess and to the pleasures that pulsed throughout his body. With his submission, the tiny growth he had previously possessed in his heart was joined by a shock of robust wildflowers, whose multi-hued petals intensified in color with each heightened pulse of orgasmic bliss. Upon his release, Mildred's now healthy green foliage gave way to a perfect bloom of a yellow, touch-me-not flower, which came sprouting to life. The once dead Mildred was now alight with an effervescence I had yet to detect, even in the liveliest of humans. Her lover held the excitement of a man who had just ridden a roller coaster, his heart's milieu throbbing with its own internal life. The two parted ways, and I had to duck even further into the debris to avoid getting spotted. Excuse me. I knew that this excursion was quickly becoming even creepier than when I had started, but I couldn't stop myself now, especially with what I had just witnessed. So, despite the feeling that I had crossed the line from thief to pervert, I forged ahead. Mildred's gait was lighter now, her pace quickening, as if on a mission, and ready to burst. The dollar store bag swayed in time with her footsteps, sounding like a dried leaves crinkling underfoot. The noise became almost musical with the rhythmic nature of her stride, complete with an occasional drumbeat each time the bag hit the side of her leg. Through my mind's eye, I could still see the touch-me-not flower hovering inside her chest cavity. For a moment, I was so lost in my contemplations that she almost vanished from my sight, due to her newfound pace as she zigzagged down the city's streets and alleyways. Finally, we arrived at her next destination. It was an old apartment building that, at first sight, appeared to be vacant. Upon closer inspection, it was clear that Mildred was one of only a few tenants who remained in this large brownstone. I hung back and allowed her to gain entry, hoping that she lived on the bottom floor so I could more easily examine her next move. I watched her silhouette proceed to the back of the structure, all the while holding my breath, hoping that I would be able to glimpse more about this fascinating woman. To my good fortune, Mildred stopped at the last door and began fiddling with her keys. Once she was inside, I bolted to the end of the building to see if I would indeed be able to get a peek inside. To my surprise, I found a clear view straight into her domain via a gap in the curtains. I was especially glad now that I had brought my binoculars, although I had almost thought better of it since I knew I would look like some crazy stalker if anyone should come upon me. Her apartment was quite small and seemed to be thrown together with furniture salvaged from the side of the road on trash day. Afghans and blankets were tossed across the back of the couch, and not a thing in the room matched in color or pattern. Her dollar store trinkets were scattered throughout the room, each one holding a prominent position, lined up across the tables and shelves like a tribe of misfit toys. She carefully pulled her newest acquisition out of the plastic bag and placed him on the table facing the couch. She finagled its placement and, once satisfied, gave it a tickle under its chin like this were an actual rabbit. She disappeared into another room momentarily. I about jumped out of my skin when she reappeared, sauntering over to the window to gaze out momentarily. She stared directly at me, eyes fixed, a cobra ready to strike. I froze, feeling like a piece of prey, my mind racing along with my heart to find the words that might be a reasonable explanation as to why I, as a woman, had been stalking her and was now peeping through her window. As abruptly as she appeared at the window, she turned back around, leaving me wondering if she had indeed actually seen me. I kept my stance for several minutes, afraid to even breathe, before having the courage to pick up my binoculars once again to see what she was up to now. I could feel the color rise to my cheeks, much like how I imagined an awkward schoolboy might react to a crush that walked in on an embarrassing moment with what I witnessed next. Mildred was splayed out on the couch, her hand gently massaging her genitals. Her heart's flower was deepening with color and lines of a dark crimson hue. And lines of a dark crimson hue grew up the length of its petals, creating a map of veins as her excitement elevated. The flower itself resembled female genitalia, its delicate hood engorged, very much like Mildred's clitoris must be, at least judging by the movement of her fingers and the look of sheer pleasure that had worked its way across her face. It was strange how the act of viewing this intimate moment through the scope of the binoculars put a distance between Mildred and me, making me feel more like I was watching a movie than actually watching a physical person performing the sexual act in real time. Because of that detachment, I could become fully engrossed with the events as they unfolded. Watching her bring herself to orgasm was a surreal experience in and of itself, as I had never been one to indulge in pornographic material. However, the profound nature of this event had me questioning everything I had come to know about humanity, as well as the true potential and purpose of the snippets of soul I held within my possession, locked away in my secret room. Mildred was looking more vibrant than I thought she was capable of. Her back arching in bliss, a sow turned into a ballerina. It was as if she had been under a nasty spell cast by an evil sorceress, that only now had been lifted, allowing me to see her true beauty. Her heart's flower grew to an enormous proportion, responding to the sensations of its owner. As her body gave into the throes of orgasm, the bloom burst open with an explosion of hundreds of blood-red seeds thrusting outwards, each of them proceeding to float up through the air. The bulk of the tiny pods drifted over to the stuffed bunny, where they hovered, before encircling the toy in a cyclonic action. For a moment, all I could see was a miniature red tornado that created such a force that the bunny was now facing me. The seeds that hadn't already dissipated began to dissolve into its fabric, while the few that had fluttered out the window like magic little butterflies danced their way over to my quivering form. I was so taken aback by it all that I hadn't immediately noticed the most remarkable element of this whole ordeal thus far. The tattered, stuffed rabbit was no longer smudged with oil, but looked absolutely pristine. I stole a glance at Mildred, whose touch-me-not flower had withered and was now crumbling away and turning to dust, leaving no remnant behind, just as the mucky landscape I had grown accustomed to. Mildred herself was back to the haggard old horror, no longer carrying the spark of life I had just observed. Only the tired, heavy presence remained. My gaze wandered back to the dollar store rabbit, just in time to catch a brief glimpse of what could only be interpreted as a wink. Then it dawned on me that only moments ago this toy didn't even have an eyelid in which it could wink, since it had been ripped away when she bought it. Before I could continue to ponder this whole event, the bunny hopped off the table and scrambled up a series of shelves, landing in a space clearly meant for him. After this, he made no other movement and gave no indication that anything mystical had even transpired. Mildred trudged into another room, and I took one last look through my binoculars. The rabbit remained frozen. I steered my vision, focusing on each individual toy, wondering if they had been healed or given life by Mildred's gift. It was at that moment that I remembered Mr. Mouse and the curious scar zigzagging across his ear. This gave me the motivation to grab my stuff and rush home, shimmying into my beloved space to be with my curious friends. Mr. Mouse was there to greet me, as usual, and I gave him a knowing nod of my head. Since I felt such a change in myself, I just had to look in the mirror. I was greeted with a single yellow touch-me-not growing alongside my own heart's flower. I immediately knew I must go and check on my precious jars. I began to unscrew the toys, granting them the freedom to explore outside their tiny enclosures. The one marked Julie was the first to respond, and the essence inside began to spiral outside of her habitat, cajoling the others to join her. The thriving souls danced about the space, weaving in and out of one another, becoming brighter with each interaction. Even the more stagnant of the souls began pulsating with a dim luminescence. I was filled with an elation that I hadn't felt in years, and with that, a sense of true purpose. I rushed outside with a renewed interest in not only the bits of soul I had retrieved, but also to the actual living, breathing individuals that they belonged to. Thank you, Lori. That was good. Hope you guys enjoyed.